There you go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, one and all. Thanks for joining us in this edition of Voice of CIO. This is episode 2. And today I have with me Peter Nichol, MBRM, a Master in Business Relationship Management, and CTO of OROCA Innovations, on the theme Leading with Value Management. Thanks, Peter, for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here, Suresh.
Excellent. So for viewers, Peter, give us a quick overview of your journey and what you have been doing all these years.
Sure. So my name is Peter Nichol. I'm based in the U.S. Out of the state of Connecticut, which is about an hour and a half from New York City. I've been in IT for about 20 years. I have experience across healthcare platforms, from payers, providers, pharma. Been involved in medical devices, telecommunications, healthcare, and of course strategic consulting. I'm also, one of the thinkers on CIO.com, and I write for my blog, datasciencecio.com. I published just recently my 4th book, which I'm excited about. And really my focus is connecting strategy to execution for companies around data science, digital transformation, and large-scale technology deliveries.
Excellent. So quite intrigued because this theme is about leading with value management. And your book, the last book, the 4th book as part of Leading with Value. What made you to write the book?
Yeah, appreciate it. So really, I saw my team struggling. There was, for the last 20 years, I've seen some common themes come across in both good and bad times. It really came down to kind of justify yourself. And you never really hear, hey, we need value management, or, let's try to optimize the value that we have in our department. But what you hear is, hey, can you justify that person on your team? Or can you justify your entire team? Or even when you hear, why is this department required? Why can't we just outsource this whole thing? Those are typically what you hear. And, people didn't really understand what they're getting, in terms of value for their money. So if you think about it, if you buy a stupid commodity, like say a pair of sneakers, when you buy those sneakers, it's pretty clear what they're going to provide in terms of value. You go to the gym and you don't have your sneakers on. These days, you probably won't even get in. But even if you did get in, that treadmill exercise would be pretty difficult. And pretty soon you'd be like, hey, you know what? Those sneakers are pretty valuable. I need to put those back on. Well, when you start to have teams that are larger of 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 or 1,000 people, and you say, tell me about Bob, or tell me about, what if Mary wasn't on your team tomorrow? Yeah, well, I kind of need her, but you have 28 other people. Couldn't they pick it up the slack? And the reality is probably they could, temporarily, but not permanently. So this is the challenge that every individual has, really, either knowingly or unknowingly, and they face it every day. Some leaders are a lot more overt and obvious about it, but really that's the challenge that we're trying to tackle.
So what problem are we solving? And can probably you can make this real with a situation so that we can kind of understand, because I know that we are beating value to death in every conversation and trying to understand value, because we're being more subjective. And people talk about ROI and stuff like that, but let's kind of granulate, because you've done a lot of things around value. So give us a real life situation that we can actually comprehend it better.
Absolutely. So I guess what I'd do is I'd start with, like, what problem are you solving? And the problem we're really solving is, it's challenging to articulate the impact of what you or your team has accomplished. You can talk about different things, but ultimately it's pretty hard to articulate to a C-suite or CFO, a CIO, or even some type of executive director about what the real impact is. And the solution is leaders that utilize value management get their voices heard more often by senior leadership. So here's a situation. You have a project manager and they complete a project, or a product owner completes a sprint, or a team leader achieves some type of corporate goal, or even a department head introduces a new product to solve an existing organizational problem.
Right.
But, it comes down to, how does that leader really know that value management can ultimately help their organization? And this is kind of where I'd start. I'd start by saying, it's great that that project manager completed the project, but what if that project doesn't align to the corporate goals? Is it really valuable? The sprint came in on time. Okay, great. Well, what if that sprint, connected to a release train that connected to a value stream that ... Does that even connect to strategic goals? Everything could have been delivered as planned, and it's just not linked.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really impact, the bottom line from an executive perspective. And likewise, when we talk about teams or even department levels, these questions become a lot more difficult. And really, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that value can be rephrased in a lot of different ways. So you typically don't hear somebody talking about, well, we need value management, or we need a value management organization. Well, that's probably what they need. What you hear is these issues that pop up and manifest, as issues, and probably get aggregated as problems. And when they surface, what you really hear is, can you measure your individual? How do you measure your individual performance for this quarter? Or what is your contribution? Or, quantify the achievement of your team. And then you're kind of like, oh, Jesus. Or, demonstrate the impact of the changes that you made as a leader into the department and how it affects that organization. So you're pretty confident what you did, and you feel pretty great about that. And you're really proud of your team. And you want to be an evangelist that's positive, as a positive advocate for that group. But how do you quantify and articulate back and communicate to the leadership the great impact that that group had? And that's really where the challenge comes in.
And in terms of, most of the times we get familiarized with the quantifiable return on investment or benefit realizations, but then there's a difference between benefit realization and value realization. So do you think that organizations are really spending that time to distinct between benefit realizations done by the PMO or portfolio managers towards what we call as value management? And if that is going to be the case, who is going to be ultimately accountable from a value realization standpoint?
So I agree. And I'm not sure who's going to be accountable, but I'll start with, there is a difference between delivering an initiative and just saying it was completed and it was all green and it was in budget, and saying, well, but nobody's ever used it. So is product, or is that service or interaction useful? It's up, but nobody actually is interfacing with it, and it's not being leveraged. So in that case, it's not really valuable. But a lot of times the conventional metrics of a PMO or other types of organizations, even a lean agile, a LACE, focuses on the delivery of something, a delivery on the value stream, or the delivery on X. And really, sometimes that's misplaced. Where it lives in the organization, I think is context specific, because, it really depends on individuals. Yeah. I was talking with somebody, last week, and their organization was a mess. If you didn't know who was in charge and who those leaders were, once you, and the situation was, all of IT reported into HR. And this was a pretty big, it was a medium-sized biotech pharma company. And I was like, really? How does anything get done? And I'm not fully sure how that works. But what I would say is that, maybe that individual is really well suited to enable and be an evangelist for IT. And maybe that CEO doesn't care about IT. Right. And they delegated somebody to represent and be a good advocate. So a lot of times when you see misalignment, or you look at the organizational structure and it looks almost dysfunctional, it's less about the dysfunction and more about who individually has the background and the support to really drive forward the strategic initiatives and objectives for that role. And I think when you look at value realization, it's the same type of thing. When you talk to the CFO, they, are more interested about the financials. Right. It doesn't necessarily need to be, hard cost out savings. Mary was here and she's let go, and now we reclaimed her, $100,000 or something. It's more complex than that, and it's about, reinvestment and cost opportunity and reclaiming some of the lost dollars and reinvesting them. And that's really where value management has a place. And that's what I try to do in my book, is make a playbook that allows somebody who comes in and says, yeah, I kind of know about value management, and, I've dabbled here. I've been a leader, I've been a manager, but what does it really take when I have a team of 30 people or a couple hundred people or 1,000 people? How do I aggregate the value that they provided up to my leadership, who's, X level is disconnected? In my case, only, maybe only a level or something, but even if they're like 4 or 5 levels, you need to really raise it up and make it really clear what that impact is. An example was, there were some financial improvements that were made in the organization that I was in. And what got reported out was, hey, we made these process improvements to, all these processes. Nobody cared. When we started to analyze it and do some value stream mapping and apply some of the tools that are in the book, Leading with Value, what we found was that you start to quantify it in a different way. And it was exactly the same amount of work, just presented differently. So instead of talking about, this cool process that we tweaked, which nobody ever heard of, it was like, well, when we streamlined it, we found out that over, a year and a half of this being implemented, we removed the need for 3,300 approvals. of which you CFO probably would have done 40 of those. Oh, okay. And we reclaimed 5.1 million that could be reinvested in new opportunities and strategic initiatives that otherwise we wouldn't have that available capital.
Right.
And when we look at the hours that were wasted in this like bumbled process, we took out 30,000 hours in about 18 months.
Wow.
Okay, so now you're starting to add value, and now it's starting to be clear what the impact of that simple operational fix to the financial process was. And it becomes more real to those executive leaders. And I think that's where you really start to see the benefit and start to get credibility and traction as an executive trying to lead a team. You know, especially now, it's like things are tough. And even if you're an organization that's doing well and financially great, they're still asking the same questions. You know, do you need that team? Can we reduce that team? You know, can we expand that team? If we expand that team, what additional stuff would we get out of you and out of your group? And that's, I think, where some of the challenges come in.
And that leads up to the next question in terms of how does a leader know that value management could help the organization? Is it going to be from every business unit leaders, and how do you think that they're playing it, particularly in the pandemic situation where everything is like people are trying to protect the reserves, they don't want to spend extra money, they're kind of repurposing their plan strategy in terms of asset allocation. So how much important is going to be for leaders to understand value management and propagate that to an end-to-end life cycle? I mean, people don't really understand value, they talk about just benefits and deliverables. So how do you change that mindset within the leadership team?
So first, I think it starts with education. You know, a lot of times when you start, it's like value management. You know, I think of earned value management initially, and you know, it's useful-ish in the right context if you're, you know, maybe in the government or something. But in most applications, it's not super useful because there's so many other variables that weigh more than a really predictive plan, especially with, you know, some of the dynamics and environmental market conditions that are happening these days. It's challenging to be able to have a plan that's solid for 3 years where an earned value approach will work. So the first thing is you got to educate some of the leaders on what they're really interested in. And a lot of times it's less about, you know, the ROI or the modified, you know, internal rate of return and some of the hard numbers that we're used to seeing that are still hard to provide, but they can be absolutely provided on almost any initiative. You know, even the squishy organizational restructuring ones can have hard numbers. But the challenge is it doesn't really mean much to somebody. You know, it's like trying to sell them something that's very vague and they don't really understand it. Where once you clarify and it's very clear what they're getting, like the pair of shoes, it's like, oh, if I don't have those, I'm not going to get this. Oh, if I don't do that financial process, I will have 3,300 additional approvals. I'll have $5.1 million that is not avoided, and I'll have to invest. And I'll have 30,000 hours that will have to be invested in this kludgy process. Okay, so now I see clearly what the before and after view is of investment or not investment. And I think that's where the benefit comes in for, you know, leaders and project managers and relationship managers alike to go in and be an advocate for their, you know, strategic IT partners and really help them understand and aggregate in the collective benefits that the team or organization or department has achieved. That's really where you start to see some of the 10x results.
Sure. And I know you also tackle the difficult problem of future value, anticipating the needs of the organizations, because you're talking about the infinite game and changing dynamics and not longer that you can actually imagine for a long period of time. So it's not all about what folks did yesterday. So can you tell the audience about the research that you have conducted and how it empowers leaders to anticipate executive needs?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think a lot of time is spent on what did you do yesterday? So it's like, well, justify last quarter. And you're thinking, oh, great. Okay, what did we do last quarter? And then, you know, you bring your team in and, you know, hopefully you have some stuff documented in, you know, product or projects or widgets or whatever the heck you did. And then you're trying to, you know, for lack of a better word, spin this around into value proposition of what the team accomplished, you know, and so hopefully link it to some target that was there in the beginning. It's never easy and always a scramble. What's better often in you know, once you start to mature and have some traction is start to anticipate some of those needs. And one of the ways that you can do that is by, you know, just simply linking work to goals. And an example of that is, you know, business capability modeling. So you can use tools like, you know, EA tools for, you know, essential project that does capability modeling. You can use Samu from Atoll, which does more of like architecture transformation. So if you had to go from like one state of an environment to totally transform your business model, that's an awesome tool. PlanView Enterprise One has some cool capabilities that just came out in the last several years for enterprise architecture. They focus more on investments, scenario planning, some of the financial analytics, and linking technology to objectives. And they focus more on like total cost of investment. And if you have a tool that can link your mission to your objectives to some of those strategies, and maybe even to value streams, then instead of having those last minute discussions, you have these proactive discussions about, yep, we've already linked this together, and this is how we think it's going to play out, and this is how we're going to present that value proposition once we complete it. Very similar to like a critical to quality or success criteria in a project, but a little bit more specific and prescriptive. Once you can do that, then as you go through, you can have almost like a ongoing value meter or a measurement that is totaling the value that you deliver, and maybe it's quantified in cost avoided, or effort avoided, or effort saved, or people hours recovered, or something like that. But ultimately, or process time duration shrinkages, or accelerated in the market deliveries. But what's cool about that is it allows you to plan in the future and get a little bit ahead of it. Another thing that comes to mind when you think about anticipating, value propositions is leveraging Six Sigma to anticipate outcomes. And there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do. My background as a Six Sigma Master Black Belt comes in a lot, and I mentor and coach a lot of teams. And what I find is that, when you apply a more statistical process control on some type of process, it becomes very easy. Is like 2 greater than 4? No. Okay. Well, where do you want that line to be? And a couple examples of that is you can use, design of experiments with takt times. So you have an idea, are we going to meet the forecasted demand? And takt time is, the maximal acceptable time to meet the demands of the customers, or, simplifies. It's basically the speed at which you need to create a project to satisfy whatever that customer need is. A lot of times people think of how many widgets come off a line every so often. So it's that time between widgets coming off a line, or projects getting delivered, or product releases, or value stream realizations, or whatever. Another thing that comes to mind is just a simple paired t-test. And you can use that for new product launches to try to isolate training effectiveness. So for example, you have this initiative, you launch this new product, you guys are really excited about it, and you ramped up your training, all your training materials are ready to go. You go out to the field and you train them. Was that training effective? I mean, who knows? Right. You can use, that type of test to use analytics to determine, with some level of statistical confidence, if in fact you had significant impact, and what degree that impact was. How effective was that training for that manager on your team? Similarly, using binomial probabilities, you can manage expectations. And one really example I love to share is, if you evaluated the last 60 days of value stream delivery in your organization, it could be project or product, but I'm thinking value stream to make it simplified, to determine which products or value streams will be delivered late in the future. So now you can go to your leadership and say, hey, based on historical 60 days, I can tell you that in August, which hasn't even started yet, all projects, those 8 projects out of the 50 that start in August, all will be delivered late.
Right.
What? So once you start to be able to quantify this and articulate this and forecast, well, how do you know they're going to be late? They're not even started yet. Well, I did this distribution and determined based on historical performance that we're going to have these challenges. That doesn't exclude new challenges that pop up, like right. Funding or resources or whatever. It just says, based on our current trend, we're not going to deliver those on time for our customers. You better start setting expectations. And the last kind of thing that comes to mind is just like a ZMR chart, which is really just a stacked line chart. But it's kind of helpful to show, quarterly variance when you're forecasting, and how you've improved quarter over quarter. So, one thing that we all have to do as leaders and executives is, keep an eye on the financials to understand, our spend rates and run rates and so forth. And you can do that really easily and determine how accurate your team is forecasting using one of those, ZMR charts. And it's a lot more simple. It's simpler to look at a view and say, here's the view. Oh, it looks like we're higher than we should be. Here's the view. It looks like we're lower than we should be. You're, coming in under budget or whatever. So that could be good, or it could be, opportunity cost loss because it wasn't invested in a timely manner. But some of those different examples, I think, help an executive understand what value is, how to articulate it, and how to communicate back to some of those leaders. And as a result, as you start to educate your teams, those teams become more and more value aware and value intelligent. So that instead of starting from the basics and trying to do all this basic education, you kind of slow down and bring them along on that journey. So they're like, oh yeah, you know what? Let me ask this question about what the adoption is going to be on this product, or how many people are really going to use this. There's always the cases where those two users are critical and it doesn't matter how much it costs, it just has to get done. But those are always the edge cases. So a lot of times, if you have the product and it's $100 million and only 1,000 people are going to be on it, I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to deploy it or to have some type of workaround. And those are some of the questions and decisions you allow your team to bring up early before you have those investments, the investment commitments made.
That's great. I mean, it's a ton of information on the small, think of a number of techniques that you brought in. The last and final question for the day was, as CIOs, because the voice of CIO series, what do you think they should do in incorporating value management as an enterprise-wide initiative? Should they have some like a kind of the best practices put across, form a team to drive value management office, like what we have as a project management office, so that we bring in statistical methods, best practices, all the organizational effective historical information to build that? How can they make it a reality? And you talk a lot about in the Leading with Value book. How do you think that CIOs are better equipped to make value management an integral part of the organization?
That's a great perspective. It's tough, because organizational change requires the changes in your employees and your teams and the value, beliefs, and behaviors to get modified. So, how do I change your opinion that living in the city is better than living in the country? I mean, it's a tough proposition for some people. The way I'd start, I guess, is start small. So if I kind of think about the history of Deming and total quality management and the transformation and total process re-engineering and some of the different shifts we had, well, how did we get adoption there, and how did we get adoption even into project management in the 70s and 80s, and then how did we get adoption into some of this lean and agile? It starts small with small wins. So in the parallels to innovation, I think building a team that is special people in a special building and they're all the innovators, like, they're not going to be well accepted. One, they're not going to have knowledge of the business domains, which is most critical. But second of all, they're not going to be really welcomed. So you need to have folks in those different business functions and the business units in the verticals, in those operational areas that have knowledge that can be advisors. So I'd start with somebody, a group that has some potential, that maybe is a little bit more aware that this is a need. A lot of times it starts under the CFO or under CIO, where they say, hey, listen, I got to report to the board. So I hear all this cool stuff being done with cyber. Translate this to what the impact is if we didn't do it, and make it real of like, okay, so we invested 30 million in this. What do we get out of this? We hedged our bets a little bit and we didn't get hacked, or we're getting hacked, or, and I think as you start to quantify some of that stuff, it becomes a little bit easier. But I'd start with a small group, and just like a Six Sigma, team 10, 15 years ago, I'd start with a small tiger team and slowly start to build. Eventually, I think it doesn't need to be a standardized, best practice environment where you have horizontal, ties cross-functionally to the organization, because, you don't want to have that team represented in 8 different groups, so the whole hub and spoke model, could potentially work. It kind of depends on what the organizational structure is, but big picture, I'd start small and get a couple people who are very competent in that space. They might even be consultants that come in and provide some guidance. And it doesn't have to be like a new entity. I think the PMO, in my opinion, is pretty much dying out. It's the function is never going to go away, but that need to, just provide financial reports and updates and here's a red, green, yellow. Like, I don't need that as an executive anymore. So what I do need is I need somebody to tell me that 8 projects in August are going to be delayed. That I do need, So, it was funny. I was talking with a vendor yesterday about AI and product management and project management. And, they were trying to pitch a cool tool that was an AI project management tool. And I said, this just shows me like red, green, yellow status. I had that 25 years ago. What I want to know is like, give me some, inferences, which is what AI is supposed to do about things I didn't know. I'll give you data set A and B and you tell me C. Like, I don't know C. You need to come up with that. I need that intelligence, that learning algorithm to learn A and B and develop and say, hey, by the way, you should look at this. I don't want to see my burn rate if it's fine,
Sure.
or an issue if it's been mitigated at the corporate level. I want to see stuff that's probably going to pop up that I didn't anticipate. And I thought, oh, you may not know about this, but 8 of your 100 projects have this same critical issue, and 4 of them have been delayed in the last 3 weeks. That would be good to know. I don't want to write a rule to go do that. I want that tool to just dynamically be aware of some of those things. So I think when it comes to adoption, you got to start small and you got to get quick wins.
Great. I think that's great insights. And I have read the book about Lead with Value, and I strongly recommend everyone to get his copy of this book. It's amazing nuggets of wisdom, practical insights that you will all enjoy. Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing your valuable insights today. I hope people will have a good takeaway. And as I said, go there and refer to this Lead with Value book. It's an amazing book for everyone, especially leaders who can take advantage of the situation. Thanks a lot for again, making your time.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Thank you.